today she's going to be talking about why adolescent fertility is so high in the U.S. Magali.
Thanks. So you can interrupt me for specific questions during the course of my talk, but for more substantive issues, I'd like to keep that for the discussion at the end. And I'm hoping to keep my presentation short enough that we'll have a lot of time for discussion. So this paper, or this presentation, deals with an issue that's going to be a chapter in a special issue of the French journal, which was, so it's a commission work. And as surprising as that could seem, I'm considered as a sort of expert on US demographic trends and events by the French research community. And so when this journal, which is called Travail, Genre et Société, meaning work, gender, and society, which is a pluridisciplinary journal, decided to put together a special issue on the US, I was specifically asked to write a chapter or an article on this issue. And I was specifically asked to keep it as simple technically as possible. So I must warn you that this is not going to be a very technically challenging paper. And it's mostly a review of the literature. I did very little original research, a little bit because I couldn't help, but the original plan was to have a state-of-the-art paper and a review of what we know about US fertility and why it's so high compared to other countries. So I'm going to be talking about the data and the motivation for this paper. Then I'll give you some background about historical trends in teenage fertility and current levels. And I'll give you some information about some points of comparison. What I must tell you too is that because this is going to be published in the French paper, I was asked to provide a few references to the French context on this issue. So I'm going to give you some comparisons with other highly developed countries, but most of it is going to be compared to France. I will tell you about who teenage mothers are, basically young, black, and poor. I will discuss approximate determinants of teenage fertility, so I will be discussing marriage, sexual behavior, contraceptive use, and abortion, again in comparison to France. And then I will discuss the larger socio-economic, political, and cultural context of teenage fertility in the US. The sources I will be using are mostly peer-reviewed articles and a number of reports, in particular those published by the Guttmacher Institute and by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And thanks for pointing out the very recent publications. I'm going to be using data from vital statistics, mostly about birth and abortions, and also survey data. And the main surveys, or those I found most useful, are the National Survey of Family Growth, which is a repeated survey conducted in the US on a sample of 10 to 20,000 women every 7 years or so. There have been some before 1995, but I will run that one back. And I used results from this survey. So for 1995 and 2002, I'm relying on analysis conducted by others, and then I added the comparison point with a more recent survey of 2016. And I picked this survey because it's the easiest to compare with the French survey called COCO, which is a contraceptive cohort of contraception, which was conducted between 2000 and 2004 with the baseline in 2000. Though I couldn't actually get my hand on the data sets because of a number of issues, mostly technical. So again, I'm relying on information that were provided either through publication or through the people who were in charge of the survey and who published extensively on this. There is a more recent survey that was conducted in France in 2010 called FECOND, which would have been perfect because COCO only interviewed women 18 years and over. while the more recent survey found infertile women starting at age 15 with a larger sample of teenagers. So it would have been perfect, but they're still cleaning up the data because they used it before and there were problems and they had to go back, and so they were very reluctant to let me use the raw data, unfortunately. So there's been I was actually surprised by the amount of publications in the US, by contrast with France, for instance, on the issue of teenage childbearing. And one of the motivations for the large body of publications early on, starting in the 70s and even in the 90s, was that teenage childbearing was viewed as a serious social problem, and was also viewed as potentially easy to lessen through political intervention, policy measures. Teenage fertility was stigmatized for its consequences in terms of health. Some studies show that teenage mothers had more severe complications at delivery, that their children had lower birth rate than others, that they had higher rates of infant mortality, there was more mental retardations, and a number of other reproductive health effects on the women themselves. Teenagers giving birth were also characterized by lower academic achievement, higher poverty rates during their teenage years, but also later on, by higher unemployment rates throughout their life, by a higher proportion on welfare, and by lower marriage prospects than other teenagers. Since we're starting already at the end of the 1980s, yes?
I was just wondering what you mean by that last point.
Lower marriage prospect, they were less likely to marry than teenagers. Yes, than teenagers who didn't have a child, with comparative controlling for social impact. So this literature was actually seriously questioned, especially over the past 10 years, but also starting at the end of the 1980s and the 1990s. And I will get back to this point. But because of these concerns, a very large amount of literature has been generated. And I'm relying on many of the findings to make this presentation with an eye to the kind of biases that have been underlined later on in the literature. So we'll get back to that. Okay, so here we have a picture of trends in teenage fertility and teenage birth. So these are for women less than 20, and I will try to specify during my talk whether I'm talking about women below 20 or women 15 to 19, but they're very close. There is very little fertility among women below 15. So you can see here the progressive increase interrupted by war in the number of births to women to teenagers, which reached a peak here in 1972, I think. And then the decline with a little interruption here. And then the more recent increase here. But this data goes to 2009. And here's the birth rate. So let's look more specifically at the birth rate. So this is the number of births for women aged 15 to 19 for 1,000 women in the same age group. So, oops, here you see the low of just the Second World War and the baby boom that has also affected teenage girls throughout the 1940s and especially the 1950s, with a maximum that was reached here where 10% of girls 15 to 19 were giving birth every year. So that means that by age 20, you'd have nearly 50% of women in the US having given birth to at least one child.
Married and unmarried kids.
I'm sorry?
Married and unmarried.
I think that I need to that later on.
But these rates, the denominator is all.
Yes, it's all women. Okay, sorry. And most of these were married at the time. And then the decline to 1976, and then a relative plateau here until 1986 for about 10 years, an increase here to 1991, and then again a decline until 2005. So at its peak, about more than 500,000 girls would give birth every year, girls below 20 in the US. So today, the fertility rate for women below 20 is about 42 per thousand in the US. This decline here, I won't say much about it. I'm sorry. Yeah, I won't discuss this decline very much, but there is some literature about that. And the factors are not clearly documented. There's been some literature about the expansion of family planning services and through Medicaid, yeah, and also about welfare programs for single mothers, which benefited teenage mothers because they're most likely to be unmarried at that time. But these seem to have contributed fairly little. It seems to explain only about 15% of this decline. So we'll get back to that when we discuss contraception and abortion. So how high is US fertility compared to other developed countries? So let me show you a slide here where you have these are UN data. And
Thank
these
God for
are
Bulgaria.
So there were many more countries which were all below the USA, but there were small countries that I got rid of just for the visibility. But I didn't do any selection. These are all what the UN consider as developed countries. And for instance, we had here something like South Korea and Singapore, but they had even lower rates than Switzerland.
Would this order change if this were the fraction of all births that were births to teenagers? In other words, the U.S. has rather high fertility compared to many of these countries overall.
To many of them, but even at, well, you see by, well, it's not, studies in Europe have shown that there is no correlation between the level of fertility and the early childbirth. For instance, in countries of Eastern Europe and the former USSR, the mean age at childbearing is very low. It's the lowest in Europe, but they also have fairly low level of fertility. And there are large variations within each group. So the US is here at 42 per thousand. In the country of Bulgaria. And actually these two countries are fairly, though they are extreme, they're fairly representative of the regions in which they're located, with the US pretty close to other English-speaking countries like New Zealand and the UK, and Bulgaria pretty close to other European countries. And then at the bottom here, you have Western and Northern European countries, and Japan here, and France is here at 7 per thousand. So a difference of 1 to 6 between France and the US. Okay, so not only has the US a very high level of teenage fertility, but this is especially true for the younger teenagers. So these are fertility rates by single year of age, between 12 and 19, and they're stacked here. In France, you can't even distinguish the rates up to 16 because they're so close to zero. And you can see here that the low level of French teenage childbearing is not, compared to the US, is not recent. Even though there was a decline, a severe decline in France, it was even originally, in the 1950s and 60s, it was pretty much at the same level as the US in the past 10 years. You can see here, but I'm going to show you here, this is the ratio of the US to France. And you can see that the teenage fertility in the US is disproportionately high for the youngest teenagers. 15, 16, and then getting closer as you go higher in age.
So the highest one is 15?
Yes. Yes, they are in the order listed here. So at 15 here, at the peak of the recent peak, there was a little increase. I don't know if you remember that. Here, there was a little increase here. And because France didn't experience this increase, then for the past 20 years, this was the largest gap between the two countries. And so here, fertility at age 15 is about 18 times higher in the US than in France in the early 1990s. But still now, and the ratio is has been pretty stable over the past 10 years or so. It's about 10 times or 9 times, I think, higher, declining to about twice the level for 19 years old. So one of the factors that would explain the difference is marriage. So returning now to the proximate determinants of teenage fertility. And we're going to talk about marriage because though this hasn't been very much investigated, we know that American teenagers are more likely to get married than their European counterpart. For instance, by age 20, 20% of US women are currently married, which is only the case for 5% of French women. So of course we would expect more fertility within marriage, either because marriage is considered as the main locus for fertility behavior, or because of shotgun marriages, women getting parents, getting pregnant, being more likely to marry than others. Though the proportion of teenagers who marry after conceiving outside of marriage has been declining sharply. I think 30 years ago it was then, or 40 years ago in the 1970s, it was, I think it was 60%, and now it's only 10%. So American teenagers are more likely to be married than European teenagers, and those who are married are more likely to be mothers in the US than in Europe, even if we exclude the issue of premarital conception. But even if we restrict the analysis to unmarried teenagers, fertility is still much higher in the US than it is in Europe or in France in particular. So here you have fertility of unmarried in the US. So this is the rate of fertility at 15 to 19 for all women. Here is the rate to unmarried women. So you can see that it's converging because the fertility rate for the proportion of women who are married among teenagers is been declining sharply. And then here you have the proportion of birth to unmarried women. So you can see it increased to about 90%. Currently from a low of less than 20% in the 1960s. So I'm going to digress a teeny bit to talk about, because one of the initial factors that was investigated in the literature was the impact of the large heterogeneity within the US population compared to European populations, and in particular the racial diversity of the US. And this is an obvious illustration of this issue, since you can see the huge difference in teenage fertility rates between the different races. So until 1990, the groups that were the births were classified by NCHS into these 4 main groups: white, black, Native American, and Asian. And then starting in 1990, there was a new classification. But you see here it doesn't make a huge difference because Hispanic were taken out of the equation to be a separate group. So what you see here is during the recent peak of teenage fertility in the early 1990s, black were really at the top, and their fertility level was about 2.5 times higher than the level for white. And then it declined actually pretty fast. And so today, Hispanics have the highest level of fertility, level 20, in the US, with non-Hispanic, white, and Asian at the bottom. So I added France here. And what you see is that even if we restrict the analysis to non-Hispanic white, you still have a big difference here with the general population in France. Even accounting for we should really remove from France a large part of the immigrant population. It's not a very high percentage compared to the US, for instance. It would be more rigorous scientifically, but it would only lower the level found here. So you can see that racial diversity doesn't explain much of the difference, some of it. Another factor that's been considered previously and even more recently, and I will discuss it again in the conclusion, is the role of the discussion, is the role of poverty to explain the difference between the US and other high-income countries in teenage fertility. So here you can see the relationship between teenage fertility and the percent of children living below poverty line in each of the 51 US states, with a very high correlation coefficient. I didn't do anything, it just came out this way. And you can see here Mississippi and other fertility, teenage fertility in the US is especially high in the southern states plus Arizona. So you see Mississippi, and then there is Texas here, and Louisiana, but this is an exception. Oklahoma, I think this is Arkansas, or there. And then at the bottom here, you see New Hampshire, which is very typical of the, which is typical of other eastern states. California is here. Pretty much smack in the middle, at least in terms of, well, yeah, in terms of teenage fertility. Though, if you remember, teenage fertility in France stands at 7 per thousand, and even in New Hampshire, it's at 15 per thousand. It's still twice the level found in France. So, is it more sex? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there is no originality of the US in this respect. Age at first sex declined very steeply during the 1970s and the 1980s, as it did in European countries. But it increased again in the 1990s and 2000, which was not the case in European countries, and in France in particular. Today, it's very close to France. The mean age at first sex is 17 in both countries.
That's for females.
That's for females, I'm sorry. So this decline in sexual behavior is showed by a number of studies. So for instance, here you have the proportion of high school students who ever had sex. So you see a decline from 54% to 46% in the past 20 years. And the number of sexual partners also declined. So here it's the proportion of high school kids who had at least 4 sexual partners throughout their life.
Is it boys and girls?
You have to say what gender you're talking
This is
about.
girls only. I'm only talking about girls.
Oh, you have to say that.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
It would be very
the
different for
whole
boys.
discussion around it. So this is from the National Survey of Family Growth, where you can see that there is a huge difference between the 15, 17 years old and 18, 19 years old. So a lot of, well, because we saw that 17 is the average age as per sex. There are differences in terms of the relation, in terms of race, with white and actually Hispanic having a pretty comparable level recently of early sexuality, but the non-Hispanic black having higher levels. So it declined for both of these groups, while it increased slightly for Hispanic, and all of the differences here are significant statistically. Let's see if I have. So it's not sex. So is it contraceptive use? Is it that teenagers in the US have a lower prevalence of contraceptive use than in France? So here you have the proportion of 20 to 24 years old reporting. So it's a retrospective questions about whether they use some form of protection at first sex. So there are serious recall biases with that kind of information, but there isn't really any strong reason why it should be different between these different countries. So of course we could discuss it. But you can see here the difference between the US, where a quarter of teenagers, if we believe these numbers, were not protected at first intercourse, compared to only 11% in France and in about 20% in the UK and Sweden. This was from a bookmaker comparative study. And this is about the last sexual intercourse, which is probably more reliable, but which again shows huge differences between the US and European countries. And the proportion is about twice as much in the US as in France. So contraceptive use is one of the important proximate determinants explaining the difference between the US and France. So not only are American teenagers using less contraceptive methods, but they also use methods which are a little bit less effective than France. So here you have the change. So you have the condom, as in Europe, or especially France, is the first birth control methods, though in many instances it's also used for health purposes to limit the transmission of STDs. And the pill is a close second, and then injection, withdrawals, and all other methods represent a very small proportion of use that. Again, this is first sex. So in the NSFG, we have information starting at 15, but because I'm going to give you some comparison with France, I restricted the analysis here to 18, 19 years old. And again, this is about the first sexual intercourse, which on average occurred a year and a half to 2 years before the interview, at 17. So here, I'm comparing, so this French survey is from 2000, so I'm comparing here the US, and I'll give you the numbers again for the US in the 2002 survey. And here I'm giving you the numbers for France. So unfortunately for France, we don't have much details, but what you can see is this, well, I'm telling you that afterwards, but this includes dual methods. That's why the sum of the proportions is higher than 100%. And the most common combination is condom in the pill. So you see here that total condom use is 84% in France at first sex, and 50% in the US. And data from the more recent survey, the 2010 survey, suggests that this number has actually increased and is now closer to 90%. So 90% of French teenage girls report that they used a condom at first sex. and 43% use the pill compared to about 30% in the US. So there's a huge difference here. And also for other methods, though in favor of the US, withdrawal is pretty common in the US compared to France. These 2% would include withdrawal plus all other methods. And you can see here the difference in girls who report not protecting themselves at first sex from 21% in the US to 7% in France, so 3 times less. So obviously contraception is a major factor. Could it also be fewer abortions?
Is the pill available over the counter in France?
Okay, so I can give you some information about that. What happened with the pill is that since 2001, teenage girls in France have free and anonymous access to all contraceptive methods, including the pill, and since 2004, including emergency contraception.
That's amazing.
You can go to the school nurse, the high school nurse, and get it for free. You can also go in a pharmacy and get it for free with no question asked. So there is
No parental consent, nothing.
right.
Good. Yeah.
So the typical process is for teenage girls in France, when they anticipate that they're going to initiate sex, they talk to their girlfriends and they go with one of them to the local family planning clinic because no one goes there basically. And then afterward, when they're more comfortable, then they might go to their general practitioner to get prescriptions. Okay, so here are abortion rates for US teenagers at 15, 17, and 18, 19 over time. So you can see the increase. So just a reminder, in the US, abortion was under specific circumstances became illegal in 11 states in 1970, and then throughout the country in 1973, though only for the first trimester, and the states had the possibility to expand the duration of that, to expand to the second semester the legal status of abortion. However, still now, there is a huge proportion of states which require parental consent to provide abortion. I think it's 2/3 of the states.
That might explain the lower 15 to 17-year-old rate because they need parental consent.
Well, it's also that they are less likely to be pregnant then.
Oh, yes. It's not pregnant. Okay.
So let's compare with France. So in France, abortion became illegal in 1974. And what I must say actually regarding abortion is that it's never been an issue since then. By contrast with the US. Actually, there have been, I think in 2004, there have been a new series of laws that have been passed to criminalize anti-abortion interventions. So if you prevent in any way voluntarily someone to get an abortion, you can be prosecuted.
Is any political party, even like Marie Le Pen, is she against abortion? Even there,
It's
okay.
completely evacuated from the political debates or the public debate. In the US, just to give you an idea, today 47% of the population supports abortion, and 44% of the population oppose it. So the population is, I was surprised to see how divided the country is on these issues. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what you can see here is that abortion declined in the US, and I'm not going to discuss that a lot, but this is not due to declining rates of unwanted pregnancies. It seems to be more due to an accumulation of restrictions on abortion. While in France, it increased slightly throughout the 90s and the last 10 years. So this is for 15 to 17, but what you can see is that there's been a conversion trend, so that today, for 15 to 17 years, the rate is pretty much the same in France and the US. And this is for 18 to 19 years old, so you can see that the US is still lagging behind France. It's been fairly flat, at least since the mid-1990s in France. Okay, so I'm gonna now enter the discussion. Sure.
So those are per 1,000 women, but they're not per 1,000 pregnancies, because if you add it together,
No,
the
because
births,
pregnancy rates are lower.
exactly. So the fraction of pregnancies that are aborted in France is actually substantially higher than in the United States.
Yes.
So just to clarify what those graphs show, which is one of the tricky things.
Yes.
So it's paradoxical, because actually you can have a much lower sort of provision of abortion on a per capita basis, and yet have it be utilized much more frequently as a response to pregnancy, when pregnancy is much lower.
Right. Okay, so the literature that's been produced over the past 10 years has brought a lot of clarification on these issues. And when you read the whole thing, and there is a lot, but there are two main culprits, and they're related to the high level of teenage fertility in the US. One has to do with economic inequalities, not only poverty per se, but also inequalities within the country or even within states, as some of the research has shown. And the cultural context. In the US, the problem is that teenagers get pregnant. In France, the problem is that they give birth. No one cares about their sexuality. So the policy in the US is oriented to trying to discourage girls to have, to be pregnant, to become pregnant. So in certain places to have sex. While in France, the issue is to increase abortion services, but with the view that it's not really a good thing, and so we need to expand contraceptive use for teenage girls and access. So it's a very different approach. And the French approach is very typical of Western countries, especially Northern and Western European countries. So the fact that teenage fertility is framed as a social problem or even a moral issue has has important implications in terms of policy and trends in this thing. So in terms of economic inequalities, I actually so the literature on this part has been produced in large part by a few number of researchers, including Arline Geronimus, Otts, and some of his colleagues, Seth Sanders, for instance, and then Crony and Levine, and there were more dates here. But these people work for the National Bureau of Economic Research. And what they showed is that the initial studies produced in the 70s and 80s showed a correlation between teenage childbearing and poor economic and education prospects for women. But all these people showed that there were serious biases with this study because they weren't using basically the right controls. They were comparing teenage mothers to other teenagers in general. While we know that there are strong, especially now, after all these studies, that there are strong selection effects, so that if you don't control for pre-existing economic and social conditions, you will find a mechanical correlation between childbearing and poor economic prospects. But because both are related to these disadvantaged backgrounds of the teenagers who become mothers, So these studies have tried to correct this bias by conducting very sophisticated analysis. For instance, they will compare teenage brothers with their sisters who had children at a later age. Or they will compare teenage mothers with teenagers who became pregnant at the same time but were victims of miscarriages. So these women would have had kids without these exogenous factors. And they did a number of things to try to control for heterogeneity. For instance, one of the things that was very interesting is they found, or they suspected that girls who were not doing very well at school, who thus had poor future prospects in terms of academic achievement and future employment or lifelong earnings or things like that, or even marriage, were more likely to give birth than others and to actually be ambivalent about whether they wanted a child then or not. Because the proportion of women who say they don't want children before they have them among teenagers is very high, but because of post-rationalization, a lot of the women, the teenagers who gave birth, actually say they wanted the children they had, even though for many of them the pregnancy was a result of contraceptive failure. Because I showed you that the effective contraceptive methods used by US teenagers are not as effective as in Europe. And actually it's very interesting because Trussell has done some work on contraceptive failure rates in the US, and the same work has been duplicated in France recently, and they showed that the failure rates for the same contraceptive methods are much lower in France than they are in the US. Because these failure rates, the way they're estimated, are based on actual use by women and actual pregnancy at the time when the woman declared a specific method to be her normal method. And so there are very high compliance issues, especially with the pill, but also with the condom, and of course with withdrawal, and a bunch of other methods. So it seems like maybe US teenagers are more ambivalent about desiring children at an earlier age compared to European women. So the issue is that on the lower contraceptive use and lower abortion rates, but it's also why are these proximate determinants going in this direction. Let's see. Okay, so I can talk more about this, but regarding the cultural context, the role of religion actually has been shown to be very important. So in the US, the proportion of people who say that religion is an important part of their lives is much higher than in France. I think in France, I don't have the number here, but I saw it earlier. I think it's about 15%, while in the US, it ranges between 36% in New Hampshire, the state that had the lowest rate of teenage pregnancy and also the lowest rate of poverty, and Mississippi, which is the highest with 82% of the people declaring. That's a Pew, I think that's how you pronounce it, religious landscape survey that I think they conduct on a regular basis, but these were the numbers for 2009.
5 more minutes.
Okay, well, I'm pretty much done. Just to say that I conducted a teeny multiple regression analysis that I'm probably not going to be authorized to put in the French papers, but where I was looking at the relationship between, at the state level, between teenage pregnancy, poverty, and religion. And religion that has all the religious states are found. So it's where people declare, more than 75% of the population declare that religion is important in their life. All of these states have both higher rate of poverty and higher rate of teenage fertilities. But if I control for poverty, religion still has an independent effect, a strong independent effect on teenage fertility. Okay, so I'm going to stop here so we have a few minutes for discussions. I just want what's the best case scenario for a teenage mother? The potentially positive outcome of unwed mother is that healthy, attractive, and rationally acceptable newborns may have the good fortune to be adopted by grateful couples unable to conceive.
Who wrote that?
This was not published in,
A presidential campaign.
That was Vern, Kelly, and Fisher in 1993 in the Cambridge University Press journal called Applied and Preventive Psychology, which is a peer-reviewed journal, which I found very shocking to have such a strong judgment in a research paper. Anyway, that's just to give you the flavor of what I mean by seeing that as a...
What was the context in which the statement was made?
So this was a discussion about intendedness, wanted and unwanted fertility in the US with a special point about teenagers. And they were also, throughout the paper, they kept saying and referring to previous research that showed that teenage mothers are more likely to be on welfare, to not get married, to drop out of high school, and a number of others.
So lots of negative effects.
So the implication was the only way that a child can actually have a good life would be if they have the good fortune to be adopted by a great family.
Oh, and what I didn't tell you, which I think is also interesting, is that studies have shown that teenage mothers actually do not face disadvantage compared to if they have delayed childbearing, taking the right controls into account, and they might actually do better in terms of employment and lifelong earnings than teenagers with the same characteristic in childhood or during their teenagers, socioeconomically. And they're also less likely to be on welfare than these other women. Which is interesting. So anyway, I'm ready for questions. Yes?
Well, how do you understand the last thing you were saying before the slide about the close association with the proportion in a state declaring religion to be an important part of their lives or something like that? Sorry. Do you have some notion of the intermediate variable associations or something
Yeah, I
like
have a
that?
specific thing to say about that, is that there is a strong correlation between the type of sexual education programs that are implemented in the schools. So 69% of schools in the US have some kind of sex education programs. In religious states, these programs are more likely to be abstinence-only programs. And research shows that even though abstinence-only programs might have an effect on sexual behavior, and some of the decline in sexual behavior that we've seen is related to that, they are actually counterproductive in terms of teenage pregnancy, because those teenagers who engage in sex are more likely to become pregnant than in other states. And so that's why these states, even though they have this abstinence-only program, which seem to work on sexual activity, do not work enough to compensate for the lack of access to abortion and contraceptive.
Well, that was exactly my issue too, how this religious belief gets translated into a policy. And the sex education is one, because these are state programs, and the other is what you were talking about, the provision of contraception and abortion in the state, and for teenagers especially, and what kind of support that gets, because so many of the abortion restrictions are, well, they're all now state-based, right? And so the parental consent, the waiting periods, the having to look at, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's really crucial, that it's not just the sort of moral religious thing, but it's very much acted out in terms of just blocking young people's access to information and services that they need. So that's a villain too. I mean, a culprit, whatever you call it.
Early in your talk, you showed the graphs. It showed this decline after 1990-something in the teenage rates. Is there literature ascribing part of this to the Clinton welfare reform laws, or what was happening in the 1990s that drive that drop down from 1991 to 2000? What's the story?
So the the Clinton expansion of the welfare programs and expansion of family planning programs explain only about 10 to 15% of this decline. That period corresponds to a decline in abortion too, and so some literature suggests that there were more restrictions on abortion, so it was more difficult for teenage girls to.
From 86 to 91.
No, I'm confusing this one. For this decline, yeah. So the decline in sexual activity plus increase in. So this period corresponded to expanded use of contraception, which was one factor.
The financial consequences of having a child as an unwed teenager changed quite a bit somewhere in the middle of the 1990s in the United States.
Well,
Whereas
only
the
in
other
the
things you're mentioning
only in the
trends.
only in the longer term, and not. I mean, it was advertised as a much more draconian reform than in fact it turned out to be for in many of the larger states anyway, like New York, California, and so forth.
Yeah, are there other interventions? I mean, 1991 to 2005 is quite a sudden reversal of trend.
Webster occurs in '89. That's a Supreme Court decision that turned around a number of the restrictions that were put in place during the 1980s. So the state's leeway in regulating abortion was removed or reduced after the Webster decision. So to some extent, the state-by-state restrictions are declared unconstitutional in '89. So that might be part of the decline and in because abortion then becomes easier.
But it actually goes down.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there was also a decline in abortion during that
Okay.
time.
All right.
It would be nice to combine those two.
Yeah.
Abortion and custody. When did the national campaign to end teenage childbearing start?
In the late 90s,
Late 90s.
Oh, really?
mid to late 90s.
I thought I remembered it in high school.
You think it was early?
It might be the fifth iteration of it.
But what about Everett Koop's letter about HIV/AIDS? I mean, I think there was a dramatic increase in condom use that started in the mid to late 80s. And teenagers started using condoms. So that was, I think, and then there was the introduction of the injectables, and though those weren't used that well, but I know that's at first sex. See, the fertility rates reflect not just first sex, but ongoing, and people wouldn't use injectables for first sex, but injectables are a much more common method than this suggests for teenagers in general, because whatever. It's interesting that people will be suspicious of the pill. They'll sort of have all kinds of anxieties about the pill, but then they'll go ahead and use the injectables.
Sounds to me as if you're putting your finger on what must be a large part with the consciousness of HIV spreading in the 1990s.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense to me.
So this is a question from Gretchen. Wait, scroll up the screen here. She asks, could you measure the religious cultural impact from state to state by calculating the teen pregnancy rate in each state if it had the income education of New Hampshire? Is that data available, teen pregnancies by education or family income?
Well, it's basically controlling for income and education.
But education is an outcome variable. Well, you're talking about state characteristics.
Not individual.
Well, if you had fertility broken down by education and religious view, that's what she's saying, then could you hypothetically, standardized so that they all have the characteristics of New Hampshire, then what would happen?
Well, you can't do that with survey data, but you could use like a cluster analysis. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, the question is standardization.
Standardization, demographics.
She says yes, but what the guy said. Sheshel claims no representation for Arizona.
So what she's getting at is if you control for income and education, do you still find an impact of religion?
She's just trying to quantify it because you don't have state level measure of it,
Yes.
so if your correction standardized on income and education at the state level, you get sort of a vacuum residualized estimate. If I can put words in her text.
Can you look at the relationship between religious adherence or whatever and of parents or of girls and the prevalence of teen childbearing at the individual level using the data you have? That is, some of the effects of religion apparently, at least as you're interpreting it, might work through the state level, and it might affect everyone in the state, whether they were religious or not. And I'm wondering.
Yeah, if there are some ecological effect or individual.
Yeah.
I can't because I'm looking at the data. The data with retrospective fertility histories don't have. I don't think they have religious information, but I could look. But I think I've read somewhere independently from this that people who have children, and women in particular, tend to have an increased religiosity when they have their kids. And I wonder if that would apply to who buys reasons. I don't know.
Yeah. Last question.
Interesting to look at it by parity because you've got the age of first sex going up. So the first birth, and then there's a lot of births in the teen fertility rate of second births. But over time, if the first age of first sex and age of first birth goes up, then the second birth is going to come a little later, after you've left those teen years.
And so, I'm sorry.
I was just talking about explaining the sharp decline in teen fertility from 1991 down to the current period.
So instead of having an age in 1920, then not counted.
So then the second one's not counted in the numerator.
To see if that's to see if it's only
I just think
fertility or if it's
I think it would just be an interesting first birth versus subsequent parent.
Magali, thank you very much.
Derived by a higher proportion on welfare and by lower marriage prospects than other teenagers. Since we're starting already at the end of the 1980s, yes?
I just wondered what you mean by that last point.
Lower marriage prospect, they were less likely to marry than
After they had
teenagers. Yes, than teenagers who didn't have a child. With comparative controlling for social impact. So this literature was actually seriously questioned, especially over the past 10 years, but also starting in the end of the 1980s and the 1990s. And I will get back to this point. But because of these concerns, a very large amount of literature has been generated. And I'm relying on many of the findings to make this presentation with an eye to the kind of biases that have been underlined later on in the literature. So we'll get back to that. Okay, so here we have a picture of trends in teenage fertility and teenage birth. So these are for women less than 20. And I will try to specify during my talk whether I'm talking about women below 20 or women 15 to 19, but they're very close. There is very little, mostly about birth and abortions, and also survey data. And the main surveys are those I found most useful are the National Survey of Family Growth, which is a repeated survey conducted in the US on a sample of 10 to 20,000 women every 7 years or so. There have been some before 1995, but I haven't done that one back. And I used results from this survey. So for 1995 and 2002, I'm relying on analysis conducted by others, and then I added the comparison point with a more recent survey of 2016. And I picked this survey because it's the easiest to compare with the French survey called COCO, which is a contraceptive cohort of contraception, which was conducted between 2000 and 2004 with the baseline in 2000. Though I couldn't actually get my hand on the data sets because of a number of issues, mostly technical. So again, I'm relying on information that were provided either through publication or through the people who were in charge of the survey and who published extensively on this. There is a more recent survey that was conducted in France in 2010 called FECOND, which would have been perfect because COCO only interviewed women 18 years and over, while the more recent survey, FECOND, interviewed women starting at age 15 with a larger sample of teenagers. So it would have been perfect, but they're still cleaning up the data because they used it before and there were problems and they had to go back, and so they were very reluctant to let me use the raw data, unfortunately. So there's been I was actually surprised by the amount of publications in the US, by contrast with France, for instance, on the issue of teenage childbearing. And one of the motivations for the large body of publications early on, starting in the 70s and even in the 90s, was that teenage childbearing was viewed as a serious social problem, and was also viewed as potentially easy to lessen through political intervention, policy measures. Teenage fertility was stigmatized for its consequences in terms of health. Some studies show that teenage mothers had more severe complications at delivery, that their children had lower birth rate than others, that they had higher rates of infant mortality, there was more mental retardation, and a number of other reproductive health effects on the women themselves. Teenagers giving birth were also characterized by lower academic achievement, higher poverty rates during their teenage years, but also later on, by higher unemployment rates, and a review of what we know about US fertility and why it's so high compared to other countries. So I'm going to be talking about the data and the motivation for this paper. Then I'll give you some background about historical trends in teenage fertility and current levels. And I'll give you some information about some points of comparison. What I must tell you too is that because this is going to be published in the French paper, I was asked to provide a few references to the French context on this issue. So I'm going to give you some comparisons with other highly developed countries, but most of it is going to be compared to France. I will tell you about who teenage mothers are, basically young, black, and poor. I will discuss approximate determinants of teenage fertility, so I will be discussing marriage, sexual behavior, contraceptive use, and abortion, again in comparison to France. And then I will discuss the larger socio-economic, political, and cultural context of teenage fertility in the US. The sources I will be using are mostly peer-reviewed articles and a number of reports, in particular those published by the Guttmacher Institute and by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And thanks for pointing out the very recent publications. I'm going to be using data from vital statistics.
Today, she's going to be talking about why adolescent fertility is so high in the U.S. Magali.
Thanks. So you can interrupt me for specific questions during the course of my talk, but for more substantive issues, I'd like to keep that for the discussion at the end. And I'm hoping to keep my presentation short enough that we'll have a lot of time for discussion. So this paper, or this presentation, deals with an issue that's going to be a chapter in a special issue of a French journal, which was, so it's a commission work. And as surprising as that could seem, I'm considered as a sort of expert on US demographic trends and events by the French research community. And so when this journal, which is called Travail, Genre et Société, meaning work, gender, and society, which is a pluridisciplinary journal, decided to put together a special issue on the US, I was specifically asked to write a chapter or an article on this issue. And I was specifically asked to keep it as simple technically as possible. So I must warn you that this is not going to be a very technically challenging paper. And it's mostly a review of the literature. I did very little original research, a little bit because I couldn't help, but the original plan was to have a state-of-the-art paper.